All right, are you ready for Diocletian and Constantine? So, I was sitting at a table for a bit, and there's some of these questions, like one about his conversion. How genuine is his conversion? Is it political? Is it not political? One thing that our table kind of talked about a little bit is just because you have a conversion doesn't mean that sin is going to disappear from your life. But at the same time, we kind of hope that things like murder disappear from your life. Constantine does a few of them, or more than a few. And it's I think a good question to look at from our perspective, because you could even ask, like, is your conversion genuine? And the answer that most of us would give is probably something along the lines of, well, sometimes it is. There's times where we're really striving to love the Lord. There's times where we're really striving to be honest about our mistakes and failures and ask for forgiveness and to live better and choose better. And there's times where we kind of just say to heck with it, to do our own thing and eat the whole pizza or whatever it is. It's a little bit like that for Constantine. And the best answer I can give you is we don't really know. History doesn't really tell us. The Orthodox have canonized him as a saint, call him Saint Constantine. In the Catholic world, we don't really accept his sanctity. But part of it is also because in the Catholic world, there's this sense that a saint is someone worthy of imitation. And we wouldn't hold up Constantine as worthy of imitation. Murdering your spouse and your oldest son and a whole bunch of your family, and ordering your army to destroy a number of towns and cities in northern Greece and all sorts of other things just because they did something that you didn't like. Maybe that should cause a few wrinkles in the fabric. But part of that is, like I said, we have a different understanding of sanctity, that at least for canonized saints, that canonized saints are people that live holy lives, heroic virtue, those kind of things. And Constantine isn't quite in that direction. He does do some very virtuous things. He does work on a lot of things. And it does seem that by the end of his life, he was moving in a much more concrete direction. But in between those times, there's a lot of leeway. There's a lot of difference. Now, we would accept Saint Helen, or Helena, his mother, as a saint. She seems to be a much more Christian woman who does some interesting things. I don't think the book talks about it very much, probably because they don't like, how much of her story is legendary. That's hard to say, but she does a bunch of things that are important. So we'll get there. I think the picture on the mosaic is of Diocletian. I think he's the one that I chose. Mosaic is a very, very interesting art form because one thing that pictures don't capture well is that it has texture. All of these little bits of rock and things that are gathered. So these are all like colored stones, and they're set in a kind of plaster or something that holds them together. Like the cathedral has a couple of mosaics. But the modern ones are not quite as varied as the ancient ones. It's like, even though artists still do them, there's a lot of precision in it. The ancient ones, sometimes it's funny to look at ancient things like sculptures and mosaic, because if you were the emperor and you saw this, what would you say? Would you be very happy with your portrait? I mean, I would say my ears look funny. Among other things.
And the eyes.
You know, the eyes, I think that's kind of this Greek thing. There's some cultural tropes in art. And if I'm not mistaken, just about every ancient picture and statue has eyes that look somewhat like this. It starts to change and get a much more realistic kind of expression later, but I'm pretty sure all kinds of early art looks like this. I remember a statue at the Newman Center that they used to have when the Newman Center was the old kind of ugly building on the, before the nice big new one. And they had this like Mary statue that I could only describe as something like Our Lady of the Aliens. Because she had these like big bulging bug eyes that stuck way out of her head. And it was just like, I don't think that looks very much like the Mother of God. And I'm not quite sure why anyone thought it was a good idea. But like this mosaic, if you're the mosaic artist, it'd be sort of funny because, I mean, this probably took, I don't know, hundreds of hours to set all those little rocks in place. And then the emperor walks by and is like, I don't like it. Like, do you start over? Do you die? Have you killed? What happens? It was very dangerous to be close to an emperor because they were fickle. So Diocletian is the first guy that we need to talk about today. And Diocletian is the one who launches the major persecution of Christians, or the most significant one, the Great Persecution. Empire-wide, most Christians die. Many, many of the martyrs that we celebrate are from the time of Diocletian. And there is some of it that is really, really creepy. I forget if it's in this book or if it's somewhere else that I read, but one of them quotes, I think it's this Galerius, who's one of the other leaders of the empire, encouraging Diocletian toward persecution, and says something like, the voices want us to kill them. And it's like, maybe don't listen to those kind of voices. I mean, now, but you have to feel that a little bit, because we can look at the question in terms of human motivations and human psychology and human understanding, look at it sociologically and talk about Diocletian and wanting to strengthen Roman identity and inheriting a place that's in crisis and trying to bring about some order and prevent its complete collapse. And there's truth in that. But there's also spiritual things at work. I think it was in our book. There's spiritual things at work that are militating, that are pushing against Christianity. And those same things are present in our own day. I mean, like one of the most bizarre experiences of the past, I would say 10 years or 20 years in the judicial system was President Obama's Health and Human Services Department that went after the Little Sisters of the Poor, who very arguably do a ton of good work. If they're in an area, everyone wants to live in their nursing homes. They're the most joyful places. It's amazingly different because of the care that they take of the sick. I mean, these are relatively inoffensive little nuns who aren't politically active. And his department went after them, and it went to the Supreme Court, and they lost. And they did it again, and it went to the Supreme Court, and they lost again. And they went back after them a third time, and it went to the Supreme Court, and they lost 3 times in a row, and they wouldn't take no for an answer. You can't explain that sociologically. You can't, one Supreme Court law should be enough to say, okay, fair enough, we were wrong. But they wouldn't let it go. And that's bizarre. These nuns, what do you have against these nuns? Why? Like, you're treating them worse than you treat people that rape and murder and pillage on the streets of New York. That's odd. Little happy nuns should not inspire your hatred like that. That doesn't make sense. Like, that doesn't fit. So Diocletian has some of that same kind of thing. Like, in a way, I think it is good to see the humanity of the man. We talked about all those crises, the army, the devastation, the plagues, the famines, the chaos at the top of the Roman Empire, the size of the empire. Things are falling apart, and along comes Diocletian, and he wants to maintain Roman order and stability. He's trying to plug the holes in the dam as the water is coming through. And so his first part is the formation of what's called the tetrarchy. Tetra in Greek means four, and so it's a division of the empire into four parts. Rather than having one emperor rule over everything, there's still one emperor. I mean, Diocletian does this, but he still wants to be boss. Like, he's going to let some other people kind of share the authority or share the day-to-day running of things, but he still thinks of himself as in charge of the whole thing. And because the Romans like their titles, and it can make you a little crazy, what ends up happening is they take Augustus as a name. Octavian, Augustus. I think it means something like highly favored one or most favored one or something like that. So they decide that that's a title for the emperor, and Caesar becomes a title for like his vice president. So there's two major areas, the east and the west. The two Augusti are Diocletian and Maximian. And then the two Caesars are Constantius Chlorus, which means like the white guy. I forget what Constantine means, but Chlorus is related to white. It seems like he had very white skin. And Galerius. Now, Diocletian is the one who wants to launch this empire-wide persecution. He's egged on by Galerius, who is his Caesar. So they live in an area called Nicomedia, which is in modern-day Turkey, south of Istanbul, on the coast of the Greek areas that were largely settled. Diocletian thinks that this is going to be a great plan. So we're going to establish a principle of how succession is going to work in the Roman Empire. Rather than having chaos and the army starting to murder everyone and people claiming the throne, we're going to have an ordered system. And so we're going to have an ordered system divided into four parts. Guess what's going to happen? Everyone wants more than they have. I want my big part, and you have little part. Is this going to solve problems? Some of them it will, and then it will create other ones. It means that if you're studying history, you have a lot more names to remember, and they come flying in and out like you wouldn't believe. But he does want to secure succession. So his idea is that you have two emperors, so that if one of them dies, then the other one becomes the emperor and names a new second. Like, that's kind of the idea, that there's always someone who's next in line for the throne. Which works until the other emperor is a creep, and then it doesn't. So the empire-wide persecution, what is very, very significant for our Western history and the history of Western Europe is that Constantius Chlorus basically pulls a political move here. He sort of makes a parade of persecuting or killing a few Christians, but he doesn't do it like everyone else does. So Constantius Chlorus rules in Gaul. I think Gaul in England is kind of his area. maybe some of northern Spain. Gaul is France, so France, England, northern Spain. That's kind of his region. And he's the father of Constantine. So Constantine's his son. And Constantine is actually in the imperial court with Diocletian. Like, imperial court means the people around the emperor. So there's the emperor, but there's still, even in a monarchy, or in this kind of case, there's still a government, a group of people around the emperor that carry out his duties or wishes. Could think of them like ministers or a cabinet kind of thing. There's still a functioning government that surrounds them. It's not like the emperor has a scribe and the scribe sends out his decrees and then everyone does it. It takes a bit more political machinery than that. A lot less than currently, but a bit more than that. So Constantine's out there, but his father, we don't really know much about his father. So his father's wife would be Helen, Saint Helen. And it sounds like she was a Christian from very early on. And quite a bit of a Margaret Thatcher, Iron Lady, you might have the crown, but I'm really in charge and I will browbeat you into submission. Thank you very much. She was a strong personality. She's probably made a saint because she found the true cross of Jesus, but her virtues might be a little bit hidden. She seems like she was a strong lady, but somehow, whether it was really genuine on the part of her husband, as far as we know, he doesn't become a Christian before his death, but she convinces him basically to stop the persecution of Christians in France and England very early on, which allows the French, that area to grow, Christianity to grow there. Maximian is the emperor in the West, and he moves to Milan. That's significant because it's not Rome. Remember Rome, the ancient city of the emperors, Rome, the capital of the empire. Lots of authors also called it like the sewer bucket of the empire, where the worst filth from everywhere comes to congregate. We think of our modern days as so different, and 2,000 years ago, the ancient Romans wrote about Rome just like some people would write about Washington, D.C. today. Now, Diocletian, he is big. If you remember in the Roman Empire, there's a fusion very much between church and state. So political offices are religious. And in this case, by church, I don't mean Christianity church. I mean paganism. There's this fusion between religion and politics. So Diocletian sees the chaos, the empire is falling apart, the armies, there's all of these disasters. And so he decides that the key to this is going to be Roman identity. If you want a politician that's very much like this today, you could look at someone like Narendra Modi, who very much sees himself in this kind of light, enforcing a Hindu nationalist policy on India. He acts very much the same way. So he wants to return to the observance of Romanitas. That means Roman virtue, what it is to be a Roman. Christianity stands outside of traditional Roman virtue, and they have this problem, which I think is sort of the funniest problem maybe in all of history. Because the auguries aren't giving them the answers that they like. The auguries, these things where they cut open birds and analyze their guts and whatever, the message that they're getting is, you're doomed. The empire is going to fall apart. You know what's really crazy about it? They were right. I mean, we can laugh at the auguries all you want, but they were actually right. The empire was doomed. It was falling apart, and it was it's not quite in free fall yet, but it's in the western part of the world, it's moving in that direction. The Goths from the north are invading northern territories. There's definitely challenges. Peoples are on the move, and the auguries So there's these problems, and the bird guts aren't giving the answer that they want, which is sort of a funny thing too, because when you're the emperor, you just keep killing things until it tells you what you want it to say. And if the priest don't tell you that, then you kill the priest. And you find someone that does. And magically, somehow, the auguries always seem to tell you what you want them to say. Isn't that interesting how that works? Well, they decide, now this is the scary part, because the pagan priests who are there performing these rituals say this isn't working because there's impious people present, and they end up targeting the Christians. That's creepy. Like, what are you talking to? Who are you talking to? What's at work? Like, it gives me a little bit of pause. I mean, it's like, ugh. Like, well, we can't have our pagan ceremonies because there's Christians present, and the Christian God is preventing these things from working right. So they decide to start attacking the Christians. They were upset that the Christians were praying. This is also one of the sort of oddest things in the world, of the modern world, that we have a secular government that does things like banning people praying in certain places near abortion clinics. And if you think that God isn't real, then the logical conclusion would be that prayer doesn't work because you're talking to nothing. So why would you be bothered by people doing it close to a building? I mean, again, there seems to be more at work. There's spiritual forces that are behind some of these things, and it's not apparent. So Diocletian, encouraged by Galerius and with the problem with the auguries, launches the Great Persecution. He decrees the destruction of churches across the empire. This is probably why none of them survive. They were really good at destroying things, just like they were really good at building things. He starts a purge of the army. If you're Christian, you lose all rank and privileges, which was very important because this isn't a world of very many human rights for people outside of the nobility. Well, if you're a Christian noble, you're basically reduced to the same political status as a freed slave. Like, bottom of the totem pole, you lose everything. He wants to destroy Christian scriptures and writings. The Galerian or the Decian persecution, you remember, that's when they started the first time to really go after the books and the bishops, like the books, the sacred text, and the leadership. Diocletian's is more general, not just text and leadership, but basically kill them all, force them to sacrifice to the emperor, and let them die. So the West doesn't do this all that much. Constantius Chlorus sort of makes a show. He has a few people killed in trials, and then is like, okay, yep, did that, take a few pictures, send it off to the emperor, we're done. It's kind of the Chinese Communist Party way of doing things. If you remember, during COVID, they were famous for building this hospital in like 3 weeks. And people have some videos from it a few weeks later, and all the roofs leak and all the pipes have burst, and like people couldn't use it. It was all for show. You can find the news stories now, like they've actually come out. Because it was build the hospital, take a picture, publish some news stories about how great the Chinese Communist Party is and how quickly we can marshal our people and do things. It wasn't high quality work, it wasn't done, but it was good enough for a picture to send to the Western press. The East and North Africa, their governors are much more rabid anti-Christian maniacs, and so they attack people. But things had changed. So one of the challenges in the midst of this, there's many Christians who are dying, but Christianity had become probably somewhere around 8 to 10% of the people in the empire. And that's significant because if you remember, there was massive plagues and all these things. A lot of people died. There aren't that many people in the empire, and now a whole stack of them are Christians. And so you can start persecution And you can claim that they're impious and they're doing all these bad things, but as time goes on, people are like, well, they're our neighbors. They're not bad people. And, with each death and the Christians taking a stand on not worshiping the emperor, not sacrificing to the Roman gods, with Christians being pushed to the limit and many of them choosing to follow Jesus instead of follow the political winds, the support for it declines fairly rapidly. Like publicly, the emperor is losing points. So eventually, Diocletian abdicates. Oh, Constantine, maybe this is Diocletian. So Constantine leaves the court of Diocletian and goes back to his father. Now again, that's significant because one of the questions that people ask is, how Christian is Constantine? He must have at least known something about it because of his mother, who, remember, she's an Iron Lady. And she ain't just like quiet about it and cooking and cleaning at home. Like, no, she's kind of boss. And so you can be darn well sure that your son knew about Christianity. Whether he embraced it or not is much harder. And he certainly hadn't embraced it fully at this time, but it's very possible that he starts to feel uncomfortable in the court of Diocletian. That something about this persecution, maybe it's the political winds of change, he knows that this is unpopular. It could be something. I mean, one of the things about Constantine is he's definitely ambitious. He has an eye on the prize, and the prize is becoming emperor. So he leaves, he goes back to France to be with his father. Eventually Diocletian abdicates, and Galerius becomes the emperor of the East. And he's like hook, line, and sinker, talking to demons and murdering Christians is his bread and butter. So Constantine is sort of named second in command to his father, and then shortly afterwards his father dies. So Constantine takes over. The legions very quickly acclaim him as, they actually acclaim him immediately almost as Emperor of the West, which is bad. Constantine doesn't want that because there's an emperor that lives in Italy. And if your army, your troops declare you emperor, and the emperor looks at you and is like, you're a little pipsqueak, this isn't how this is supposed to work. Just because your army says so, I have a bigger army than you do. Right? So it puts Constantine in a sort of difficult political situation. He's not supposed to do that. They're not supposed to do that. That'd be one of those times where as the general you're like shouting, stop, shut up, don't say this, because he knows that word is going to get to the emperor somehow that the army has done this. And that sets him up as a major political rival at a time when he's not ready for it. Constantine, like I said, is a difficult figure. He's certainly ambitious. He certainly has his eyes on the prize. But I'm starting to think that you can at least say that grace was at work in his life. It's certainly not perfect, having his wife and son murdered, probably for plotting against him. I mean, it's hard to know if the story is accurate, but the rumor on the street was that his son was sleeping with his wife and having an affair, and they were plotting to overthrow him. Whether that's true or not, it's very possible. His son and his wife did spend a rather inordinate amount of time together. And, what you do in a situation like that is maybe more of a challenge than we appreciate now, but for Constantine, he has them all killed. Some of them officially die by suicide, but it seems like the suicide was sort of at the end of a knife, and you can either drink this poison or you'll discover that you drank the poison anyway. Which would you like? In 311, Galerius is dying, and he finally sort of gives in. He's finally like, okay, the persecution isn't working. The Christians are winning. There's more of them than ever before. Something went wrong. I was just trying to save Rome. Don't blame me. But again, it was rabid persecution for a long time. So just because he says that doesn't mean it actually came to an end. They need something that actually has some teeth to it, because some people, especially corrupt politicians, are liking this persecution of Christians. Because when you kill them, you get to take all their stuff. Their land and their slaves and their gold and their jewelry and their homes. That kind of things. So, Galerius dies and ends up that way. Somehow, Maximian dies as well. He was the emperor in the West. And his son, Maxentius, takes over. Like, one of the other things is that these people almost always name their kids after themselves. And so the names look very similar. And by the time you get to like the third or fourth one, you're like, who was this? Which Max guy? Because there's about 10 more of them in the next 50 years, I think. That, Maximian and Maxentius, and it was just a thing. So Constantine is now, he wants to be in charge. So he goes to war and he marches against Maxentius. And he engages in this fight for the Western Empire. One of the things that history doesn't help you appreciate is that Constantine was a bit of a genius when it came to war stuff. He's not rocket science-y Albert Einstein, better than everyone on earth, but he's not a dumb rock. Like, he is a political animal, he's ambitious, but he's also intelligent. And he can play the long game. He's in it to win it, and he's not just foolhardy, taking risks, go blow down the emperor. He's got some plans. And in the midst of it, he's marching toward Rome. For some reason that doesn't really make sense to me. The emperor had moved the imperial court in the west to Milan. But at this point, no one in history really cares about Milan. It's like you'd think that you'd want to conquer where the emperor is, because then you'd be emperor. But for some reason they don't. They still want to conquer Rome. You still have to march to Rome and take Rome. Like, that's still important. So he's on his way there. He gets to a place called the Milvian Bridge. And oddly enough, they don't actually cross the bridge. They cross the water, and it's just close to the bridge, but that's why the battle is known as the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. And at some point before that battle, history reports that Constantine has a dream and sees this image of the Chi-rho. Chi is the Greek letter. It looks like an X, and rho is a P, but it's said R. It makes an R sound, so Chi-rho. They're the first two letters of the name of Christ in Greek, and this is where